We are delighted to welcome you to our webinar today. Oh my gosh, I see some people from Buenos Aires, Sacramento, let's see, Kentucky, San Francisco, Georgia, Maine, Wisconsin. I love it. Oh, welcome everybody. This is so exciting. Okay, so please continue letting us know where you're joining us from. So anyway, we are delighted to welcome you to our webinar today titled Interpreter Idioms and Cultural References. My name is Ana Lia, and I am the manager of training and curriculum at Cross Cultural Communications, the largest international training agency for community, educational, and medical interpreting. I will be your host today for this 1 hour webinar. Also, behind the scenes, but very, very important to me, I'd say he's my superhero, is my colleague, Zach Williams, cross-cultural communications manager of e-learning, and he will manage the chat and will also provide useful information throughout the webinar. Now, before we begin, I want to, and as we wait, obviously, I see more people chiming in. Welcome everybody as you're coming in. It's so great to have you. As we wait for a few more people to join us, I would like to share some CCC updates, okay? The first one is that now registration is open for our fall TCII TOT, the training of trainers, licenses interpreters to deliver the Community Interpreter International. The fall cohorts is just around the corner, is October 30th. If you have ever considered becoming a trainer, the TOT is the most trusted and comprehensive entry-level program in the field. The Community Interpreter International, also known as TCII. So consider attending this online training of trainers, known as TOT, and learn how to lead your own sessions. How exciting would that be, right? Of the only national 40-hour license certificate program of, again, community, educational, and medical interpreting. This international TOT has licensed over 400 trainers across the US and worldwide to deliver TCII. And Zach is going to post now on the chat the link where if you're interested, you can find more information about it. Now, let's continue. The next news that I want to share with you, and this is huge. The Remote Interpreter, an international textbook, volume 1, because there are 2 volumes, Foundations in Remote Interpreting, was published in July, just last month, at 676 pages. You just hear that. It is the first comprehensive textbook on remote interpreting in the field, written for individuals and organizations training and working anywhere in the world. This textbook offers a comprehensive introduction to remote interpreting, drawing on the experiences and expertise of 7 authors. This is amazing, who work a wide variety of roles and disciplinary settings. This is, needless to say, a landmark work. The remote interpreter sets the international standard for remote interpreting education. It is an essential resource for educational institutions and professional training programs that will teach the remote interpreting. And now Zach is going to post a link on the chat where you directly can go and find out more about it if you want to and purchase a textbook. Now, along TRI, the accompanying training program, TRIO, will be launched early fall. It is an online, self-paced, learner-centered course based on TRI. And again, it will launch on our online training platform, Blue Horizon, very soon. Lastly, but not least, we will also have our upcoming fall training courses and webinars for the rest of the year available on our website for registration very, very soon. Now, let's talk about a little bit of how this webinar is going to work out, right? The webinar presentation will last about 40 to 45 minutes, and it will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes Q&A period, okay? So you can present all your questions to our trainer. During the webinar, please keep your Q&A feature open and use the Q&A to submit questions for our presenters, okay? And I will be asking those questions later. Now, for other comments or questions for us here at Cross Cultural Communications, please use the chat feature instead. And if you want everyone to look at your comments in the chat, please make sure that you set it on everyone. Lastly, if you want to stay on after our presenter leaves at the end of the hour, okay, Zach and I, we're going to stay here and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have about cross-cultural communication and Blue Horizon. As you may know, this webinar has been approved for CEUs. We love it, right? I know, we need those CEUs. So please remember that 24 hours after the webinars, all attendees will be mailed the link to download a certificate of attendance. It will go into the same email that you used to register for this webinar. Please, before you worry, it's like, I haven't gotten a link. Go back and check your spam. I know it happens to me, or your junk folder, right? If you don't see it right away. Certificates are only available for attendees of the live session of this webinar. Now, they must be downloaded, please remember this, within the first 2 months of today's session. Now, let's see, without further ado, let's begin our webinar, okay? Interpreting idioms, and I'm going to introduce our presenter, right? Interpreting idioms and cultural references. So, we here at CCC are delighted to have today our presenter, Yuliya Speroff. She is a Russian English core CHI and a Washington DSHS certified medical interpreter and social services interpreter. In her current role of a supervisor with Harvard Medical Center Interpreter Services Department in Seattle, Washington, Yuliya supports a team of staff medical interpreters and manages translation projects. She is certified as both an English and Russian language instructor with more than 10 years of teaching experience. Yuliya's passion for teaching, hey, is realized through the work that she does for a non-profit organization. I love it. Known as American Against Language and Barriers, where she's engaged in curriculum development and training as well. Now, Yuliya is on the board of directors for the California Healthcare Interpreter Association, also known as CHIA, and a member of the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare, also known as NCIHC. I know people usually that's what they know it because I'm a trainer. I'm like NCIHC. Okay, so she's part of a work group. Yuliya is the author of the Medical Interpreter blog, which focuses in providing medical interpreters with resources and information for professional development. Okay, let's make sure I am not missing anything. And I also want you to know, I know Yuliya virtually, not in person, but she's an amazing person to work with, right? And so I just want to tell you that. Now, Yuliya, we want to thank you today for sharing your time, your expertise with our audience. We are so grateful for that. We are seeing many people that are chiming in and ready for your presentation. So, Yuliya, I am going to disappear and the floor is yours.
Thank you for such a warm welcome, Analia. You are very kind. And you know what? Since I sent you this bio, I actually acquired another credential. I passed the CCHI new English to English exam. So I'm now core CHI-P. So I'll update that for next time. Yeah, this was a very interesting experience in taking that exam. Now, today, we're going to talk about interpreting idioms and cultural references. This is one of my favorite topics to teach. I've taught it several times and presented it several times, and I never get tired of it just because I think it is so vital. So, it's going to be a bit of a mix of going back to basics, but also refining our existing interpreting skills and knowledge. And you may wonder, why do we need to talk about idioms? There are so many more important topics to talk about. Why do we, as interpreters, whether we are healthcare interpreters or maybe we are also working in other domains, why do we need to know about interpreting idioms? Isn't it more important to focus on our skills, protocols, and modalities? Isn't it more important to work on our professional terminology, right? And maybe look up new oncology terms. Isn't it more important to refine how we conduct ourselves ethically and whether we do our job in full compliance with standards of practice? Or shouldn't I worry about developing my cultural competencies so I can best serve the communities that speak the language or languages that I interpret in? Well, yes, all of these are absolutely important. These are requisite skills and knowledge for professional healthcare interpreters. But look what else I found. In addition to having an excellent command of their working languages, working interpreters must possess an understanding of colloquialisms and idiomatic expressions in all working languages. This is according to a document called What's in a Word, a guide to understanding, interpreting, and translation in healthcare, developed by NCHC and ATA. So they're actually listing the ability to understand colloquialisms and idiomatic expressions as part of requisite skills and knowledge for medical interpreters. Similarly, for court interpreters, they must be able to accurately and idiomatically turn the message from the source language into the receptor language. So idioms are more than just a fun topic to talk about, although it is fun. It is the ability to accurately interpret idioms in a way that makes sense to our parties that are participating in communication is actually an essential skill. And it's not as easy as it sounds. So there is a really wonderful book that I read as I was preparing for this class. It's called Interpretation Techniques and Exercises by James Nolan that came out in 2012. And so Mr. Nolan says the following. He says, the most common pitfalls to be avoided is not recognizing figurative or idiomatic language or translating it literally. So it is possible then for us to encounter an idiomatic expression, whether it's in either of our working languages, and not even recognize it. So let's try and address this issue, making sure that we're able to recognize idiomatic expressions when we encounter them. And we'll start by trying to figure out what are idioms? What are some other figures of speech out there? So when it comes to figures of speech, there's lots and lots of different examples. So idioms, of course, but there are also metaphors. Phrasal verbs is an example of idiomatic expressions, because the key here, as we'll see later, is that we take a word that means something and then another word that means something. We put them together and now they start meaning something else. And we can't necessarily figure out this new combined meaning by analyzing individual parts. So that's what phrasal verbs and idiomatic expressions have in common. There are puns and plays on words, which are the worst to try and have to translate or interpret. Similes, proverbs and sayings, and cultural references. So today, within the time that we have today, we'll address most of them. We won't focus on puns and jokes and plays on words as much. But definitely this is, as I'm sure all of you as practicing interpreters know, these are one of the hardest things to interpret. Let's start with our guest of honor, or idioms. Idioms are defined as a group of words in a fixed order that have a particular meaning that is different from the meaning of each word on its own. As we'll talk about later, sometimes these things are fairly easy to figure out. Like fish out of water, it's a very pretty universal idiom, right? We know that fish need water in order to be able to survive. If we take fish out of water, they're not going to feel their best, right? They're not going to, aside from the fact that they need water to survive, right? They might not be able to move the way they're used to moving. They might not know where to go and how to navigate. So clearly, when we find ourselves in a situation that we're not very familiar with, we may then say, we feel like fish out of water. This is not familiar to me. I don't know how to conduct myself and how to navigate this situation. Some might be, like and idioms can be very culturally bound, right? So when you say I have a frog in my throat or a frog in my belly or butterflies in my belly, it can mean different things in different cultures, and it doesn't always translate well, as we'll see later today. Next, we have cultural references. Cultural references are mentions of something that relates to the culture of a particular country, but it can be wider than a country. It can be also be more narrow than a country. For example, it could be something that's understood by people only from a particular city or from a particular state, if we're talking about the US, or a particular region or country, or even most of the world. So these could be references to historic events and figures, current events, famous people, whatever they're famous for, and then even fictional characters are part of that language. So cultural references are often shortcuts, right? These are these coded kind of phrases that instead of saying a whole paragraph, I can say just one phrase, and the person who shares this cultural background with me will know exactly what I mean without me having to explain it, spell it out, and give lots of examples. So if we look at the screen here, you'll see some examples of cultural references. And so let's start with, and let's see how easily we understand them, because from what I understand, we have hundreds of participants today, hundreds that come from so many different places. So let's see, how much common cultural understanding we have. For example, I am circling a picture on the slide. Who is this person in the picture there? Just post your ideas in the chat. Mother Teresa. Okay, yes, you're right. It is Mother Teresa. Now, if I called somebody a Mother Teresa, if I said, oh, well, this person, they're just a Mother Teresa. What do I mean by that? What are some things that this person, what are some qualities or characteristics that they might be displaying? Generous, a good person, compassionate, kind, selfless. Yes, very giving, all of the above. Charitable, empathetic, generous. Yes. So exactly. And I don't have to, kind of say in this one phrase, Mother Teresa, it captures all of these things that you have shared in the chat, right? I don't have to spell it out. I don't have to say this person is kind and generous and charitable and compassionate and kind and generous, right? And humble. So all I have to say, this person is like a Mother Teresa. Not a. This person is like Mother Teresa. Okay. What about this gentleman over here? I'm circling another picture. Who's that person? Okay, Napoleon. It is Napoleon. So yes, it is Napoleon. Now, what I found is that Napoleon isn't always seen the same way in different cultures. So if I compared somebody to Napoleon, what might you think about this person? So if I'm saying, this person, okay, so some of you are saying conqueror, ruthless, pretentious, and many of you are mentioning inferiority complex. So there is I don't know if this is a myth or if it is actually true, but there is this common belief that Napoleon was short and that he felt, maybe not so confident about his height. And this was one of the things that kind of drove him to try and conquer many countries. It does sound a little mythological, a little, simplified, but that's what I think of when I think of Napoleon. Like, oh, this person has a Napoleon complex or Bonaparte complex, right? It means that they have some sort of insecurity and maybe they're making up for it by behaving in a certain way. But as I'm seeing, in the chat, some of you are commenting, ambitious or talented or powerful, right? So you may have then a different association with this person, right? So yeah, some of you are saying he was average height. Exactly. I'm fully acknowledging that this might be a myth, but because of this myth or because of this conception, this is what I think of, and this is what I mean when I say somebody has a Napoleon complex. But for somebody else to say, oh, well, look at this, you're just like Napoleon, you might be paying somebody a compliment by saying that they're ambitious, or you uh, might be insulting them by saying, you're overly ambitious and too ruthless. Okay, how about this one, Blue Friday? So I'm not circling Bernie yet. Hold your horses. Blue Friday. So this is, I will tell you that this is from Seattle in particular, but also from Washington State. So for those of you that are outside Washington State, what do you think is Blue Friday? Raining. Friends, it always rains here. It's not a Blue Friday, it's a normal Friday. It's just Seattle Friday when it rains. And you know what? It's actually raining today. Sad day. Okay, so because you're thinking, aha, blue. People, when they feel blue, they feel sad. Okay, I will give you a hint. It's something to do with sports. Yes, somebody said sports team. That's right. So the football team here in Seattle is Seahawks, Seattle Seahawks. That's right. Their uniform is dark blue. And so lots of people are football fans here. And so on a Friday before a game, people might come to work wearing Seahawks colors. So it might not be the game day today, or maybe it's like the following day. So to me, this was one of my kind of, I wouldn't say cultural shocks, but cultural discoveries, right? When I go to a bank and I meet with the bank manager and maybe I expect them to wear a suit and they're wearing like a dark blue football jersey. That's because it's Blue Friday. Yes, game day. And I know from teaching this before, I know that in some other states, people might have like Red Day because their team colors are, red cheese heads. In Wisconsin, there are cheese heads. Of course, there are cheese heads in Wisconsin. I love that. Right. So this is an example of a reference that, as you can see, for many of you, you're like, what are you talking about? What Blue Friday? Is it raining? Are you sad? Like, what are you talking about? Whereas if I was talking to somebody from Seattle who is also a Seahawks fan, they'd be like, yeah, Blue Friday, Seahawks, right? So, what about this gentleman here that I'm now circling? Senator Bernie Sanders. Um, and so Bernie Sanders, this is not about politics right now. This is not about who you voted for or, whether or not you agree with particular politics. This picture is from the inauguration. And we know that a presidential inauguration is, quite an occasion, right? Again, regardless of what your beliefs are, how you voted, we can all agree it's a big occasion. And a lot of people dress up for presidential inauguration, right? Maybe some people actually practice what's called fashion diplomacy. They choose clothes by certain designers that maybe represent their values. And Bernie Sanders became a meme. He became an internet sensation because he was there. As you can see, he was wearing very much his everyday clothes. He appeared to be kind of maybe sleeping or, kind of snoozing a little bit. And he was wearing these really large mittens, right? That do not necessarily scream fashion, do not scream fashion, right? And so he kind of became a big meme. He became, people started photoshopping his picture into different situations. I'm a big social media person, I'm on Instagram and on Facebook a lot. And so he started popping up in my feed in various memes. And so, I don't really share a lot of memes, but I can imagine if I did share them, people who are not from the US, who don't really follow US politics, they might be like, who is this older gentleman? Are you sharing pictures of your grandpa? Like, why is this funny, right? Because they may not recognize the inherent humor of this situation, that we have a person who doesn't seem to care for the occasion, like many of you said, seems to value comfort over fashion. And so then let me show you the next meme. So this is a cultural references that will be relevant to an even smaller group of people, not just somebody from the who, I wouldn't say from the US, but somebody who's like familiar with the US current events, but also who is familiar with the profession of medical interpreting and knows how things work. So the caption, so it's again, it's Bernie Sanders at the inauguration, sitting in his mittens, probably snoozing, and the caption says, "The interpreter when the LEP speaks some English and wants you there just in case." So I did not make this meme. I unfortunately don't know who the author is, so I can't credit them. But I think we can all see the humor in this situation, right? We've probably, as a medical interpreter, we've been there where somebody says like, oh, we just, clearly the patient or patient's family member speaks English. We do want you here to still to ensure quality of interpretation and so that you can jump in when necessary, right? And we can all relate to how you still have to pay attention, right? So you can jump in so that you can alert parties when something is not being interpreted, but at the same time, you're kind of, a little bit on, I wouldn't say on snooze, but kind of like on hold, right? So then, and I did share this meme, and so my medical interpreter friends, they were like, haha, this is hilarious, happened to me so many times. Just like right now in the chat, there was some discussion of over whether or not you're allowed to do that as an interpreter. Should you be interpreting if you're there? But people knew exactly what this means. Similarly, on the next one. But the people who had nothing to do with medical interpreting, they were like, who is LEP? What is going on here, right? We don't understand. Similarly, the next one, when the interpreter is required to stay for the procedure. So again, maybe you're interpreting for a patient who's having a procedure and they are awake, but there isn't a whole lot of talking going on. And so you're just sitting there. This is extra funny because operating rooms are often cold. And so maybe you're just sitting there and freezing, right? And so it's very appropriate that he's wearing these large mittens. And again, it's funny because it fits, right? Because all you're doing is that you're sitting there and waiting for that one command that a surgeon gives to the patient that you'll have to interpret. Or maybe, a patient will make a comment and say something's, doesn't feel comfortable. And you're trying to stay awake. It's a good thing he's not an ASL interpreter, right? Because of the mittens. Totally get it, right? So again, this is an example of a cultural reference that is not necessarily geographically bound, but it's more to do with like a profession, right? That we all share and we understand how things work. This is an example of a cultural reference that is bound in culture. And also in a specific time. So this is a screenshot from a movie called The Story of Us. It came out in 1999. And this is a movie about a couple who is having marriage issues. And in this particular scene, Michelle Pfeiffer, the actress, her character discusses marital issues with her friends. And one of the friends says, I'm telling you, marriage is the Jack Kevorkian of romance. Does anyone know what they're talking about? Right, so Jack Kevorkian was a medical doctor in the US, and around like the end of 1990s when it came out that he was called, his nickname was Dr. Death, and that he was unfortunately killing his patients. And so the court case happened, I think like 1997, 1998. So this was very much current news at the time. The name, I know it is a horrible story. But the name Jack Kevorkian was on everybody's mind, and you kind of instantly knew, right? So this, when this cultural reference is made, you instantly knew, okay, so Jack Kevorkian was a killer. So when you say marriage is Jack Kevorkian of romance, what you mean to say is marriage kills romance, right? And there might be some other nuances of meaning there. But the point is that to understand these cultural references, you kind of have to be familiar with the news around that time, right? So maybe you were around at the time, or maybe like later you heard it. But if you're, if you didn't, then clearly, and we'll talk about what to do, right? If somebody said a cultural reference and you're like, Kevorkian, what are you talking about? I don't know. We'll talk about how to handle that. Let me show you a couple from kind of healthcare settings, right? Because all of those examples were random just to kind of convey the concept of cultural references. Let me give you some examples from medical setting. So I see some of you are interpreting, for patients who might be Russian speaking. And so here's the situation. A patient comes in, and usually when a patient comes in an outpatient setting, usually the first thing that happens is somebody takes their vitals, right? Usually a medical assistant, and they take their blood pressure. And what happens to a lot of patients who speak Russian, they might say, oh, my blood pressure is 115/80. Wow, I'm going to go into space. What are they even talking about? Why are they talking about space? Right? So when I have translated this literally, when I first started out as an interpreter, I would translate this literally. And the medical assistant would be like, what are you talking about? You're going to go into space? Are you hallucinating? Are you dizzy? Like, what does it even mean? Right? But what, of course, it means is that USSR was the first country to send a man into space, and so because of that, cosmonauts, which is of course the astronauts but from the Soviet Union, so cosmonauts became a symbol of the like perfect health. So when in English you might say this person is healthy as a horse, in the Russian language we have this link of healthy as a cosmonaut, and we don't necessarily say this, right? We don't explicitly say he or she is as healthy as a cosmonaut, but we make these references to space, right? So we may say like, put me in a spaceship, put me in a rocket, I'm gonna go into space. So that's a cultural references that because that's what I, when I was growing up, that's what I heard my whole life people talk about, right? I understand exactly what they mean and I just know, right? I just know as soon as we start talking about, and I don't know why necessarily blood pressure, but there is that link between a good level of blood pressure and then being able to become a cosmonaut. So I just know that it's coming. Here's another one. I'm going to refer you to Dr. Lass. He's the Michael Jordan of cardiosurgery. What are we talking about here? The best of the best, the GOAT, some of you, which is another idiomatic expression, right? So Michael Jordan, of course, is considered to be the best basketball player of all times. And this is a cultural reference that you might not understand if you haven't, it's not that you have to live in the United States, but if you haven't followed basketball at all, right? And so if I said this to an average elderly Russian-speaking patient, they might not necessarily get that connection, right? What do you mean, Michael Jordan? I thought you said it was Dr. Laz, right? Who is Jordan? How many doctors are you sending me to? So then for you to interpret this so that it makes sense to somebody who you interpret, you may then, we talked about maybe you'll find somebody who your patients know, and so you might say Lionel Messi, right? For example, or another big figure, or maybe you'll say the rock star of surgery, right? So whatever really works. And then here's another one. You're a smart man, mister. So the situation, the context is that the doctor asks the patient like, hey, do you check your blood pressure at home? And the patient says, well, you know what? I actually have an Apple Watch and it tracks my heart rate. It can even do like a quick AKG. So I'm keeping an eye on my heart rate. And the doctor says, oh, wow, well, that's really smart. I'm a real muggle when it comes to technology. So, yeah, some of you are guessing correctly. This comes from Harry Potter, the book. And so, in the Harry Potter world, we have wizards, people who can do magic, wizards and witches. And then we have people who are human, right? Who are muggles, who cannot do magic. And there's, of course, some discussion over whether muggle is a derogatory term. But what this person essentially means here, I'm a Luddite, I'm a dummy, right? I'm a novice when it comes to technology. So again, if you look up the word, so if you haven't heard Harry Potter, you may not have heard of the word muggle, yeah? And I don't know if this particular doctor, maybe they are a big fan. Maybe they read it to their children, so I don't know why they're familiar with the word muggle. But yeah, so that's another cultural reference that if you say this in Spanish or Arabic or Russian or Portuguese, muggle, is your patient going to be like, what did you just call me? Or what did you just say? Is there a word that successfully conveys something similar, right? So I would, in the Russian language, I use the word dummy, right? Because I think, and not dummy as in not smart, but dummy as in a beginner. If you think about those books, it was like puppies for dummies, etc. Okay, so we talked about idioms, we talked about cultural references. Next, we have metaphors. So metaphors are also examples of figures of speech or idiomatic expressions, and they describe a person, object, or situation by comparing it to something else with similar characteristics. So for example, eyes are the windows to the soul. Here's another one. These blood sugar numbers are music to my ears. You've been doing a great job of controlling your glucose. Some metaphors translate very easily. Eyes are the windows to the soul. This expression exists in many languages. In some languages, you might say eyes are the mirrors of the soul or something similar. So they're not always, sometimes they're pretty logical, right? So when you say music to my ears, that kind of makes sense, right? Music is nice to hear. When I hear music, I smile. So similarly, as a doctor, when I hear how well you've been controlling your blood sugar, it makes me glad. Similes are kind of are related to metaphors. So they're also comparing one thing with another, but they always include the words as or like. So this makes them a little bit easier to handle because when we hear the word like or as, we understand that something is being compared. So a famous example comes from Forrest Gump. My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. Or this exam table has been thoroughly wiped. It's clean as a whistle. Sometimes waiting for an appointment is to become available is like watching grass grow. And then another group of idiomatic expressions we have is phrasal verbs. So just like idioms, a phrasal verb consists of maybe a verb with a preposition or adverb or both, and the meaning of these words is different from the meaning of its separate parts, which is why we're including it here. So for example, I wanted to bring up the issue of advance directive, or unfortunately, your uncle's surgery has been called off until further notice. So these are some examples of idiomatic expressions. Now let's talk about how do we recognize them in speech and what can make it more easy or more difficult to recognize them. First of all, people use idioms all of the time. And when I say idioms, I mean all of the things that we just talked about, all kinds of idiomatic expressions. They're not doing it to make your life more difficult, you as an interpreter. That's just how we speak, right? Some people use more idioms than others. And just because we're in a medical setting, it doesn't mean that we're going to expect people to use medical idioms. In fact, there's no such thing as medical idioms. There are idioms that I use to describe being healthy or not feeling well. So like to feel under the weather, to, you know, fit as a fiddle, that sort of thing. But there's, you know, people may use idioms and expressions from all kinds of situations. So, for example, sports idioms are super common, and I'm not sure why. I have a theory that healthcare professionals, especially doctors, are competitive. So maybe that's why they like sports idioms. Maybe it's an American thing. But, hit it out of the park, right off the bat. And this could be actually part of the like conversation about medical diagnosis. Um, Expressions can come from books, from films and TV. There are lots and lots of idioms that talk about body parts, like give me a hand, or, to be pulling somebody's leg. The war and peace is a rich source of idioms. Gambling is also really huge. Lots of expressions come from conventional wisdom, such as proverbs and sayings. The Navy, interestingly enough, like you wouldn't think that, but to sail through a surgery, that's a nautical idiom, right? So we might say somebody sailed through a procedure, they did great. So that's what can make it a little bit hard when you're like, we are in a medical setting at a doctor's office, and the doctor is using these sports idioms. And sometimes recognizing idiomatic expressions can be easy if they are exaggerated or unrealistic. So when somebody says it's raining cats and dogs, even if you've never heard this expression before, you might be like, well, clearly it is not raining cats and dogs, right? I'm looking outside. I'm not seeing Labradors and Great Danes coming from the sky. So this must be an idiom, right? But sometimes an idiomatic expression may look like a normal expression, right? So for example, the word mileage. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, especially if you're a freelance interpreter who works in person. So mileage is a number of miles traveled or covered. But it also has another meaning, actual or potential benefit from something. So here's an example in context. This treatment regimen has been effective so far, meaning your tumor responds to it by shrinking. So as long as it's working, we'll keep giving it to you, and I think we'll be able to get good mileage out of it. This is another, and so clearly as an interpreter, the context will help you realize that we are not just talking about actual miles, but we're talking about we'll be able to keep using it, right? We'll be able to benefit from it for a while. And this is another case about why, Google Translate and other machine translation is still not quite there when it comes to interpretation. And that's a good thing for us, right? But they may not pick up that nuance and the fact that this is now, the word mileage is an idiomatic meaning. Here's another example of when somebody didn't recognize an idiom. So a while ago, I was watching this movie in the cinema, and I was in Russia, so the movie was shown in English but with Russian subtitles. And so in this scene, a reporter, we saw them just before, we're not seeing them anymore, but a reporter is standing next to another reporter, and they're holding a flask. And he says, "Hey, you thirsty?" And then the second reporter says, "No, I'm on the wagon. I promised Martha I'd lay off." Now, whoever was translating the captions, they translated "I'm on the wagon" as "I'm driving." Now, is this correct? Does it mean I'm right? So to stop drinking. So it is alcohol related, because when somebody says I stopped drinking, right? I'm not currently drinking alcohol. They might say I'm on the wagon. And conversely, when somebody wasn't able to abstain from alcohol, they may say I fell off the wagon, right? And I can see, and honestly, I don't want to judge that particular person. I don't know if they had an opportunity to watch a movie. Maybe they just were given the text, right? And so maybe they thought, this is kind of an old-timey movie. The word wagon is an old-timey mode of transport. It makes total sense. So they didn't recognize this idiomatic expression, right? And they interpreted it incorrectly. In this case, it doesn't really matter, This was a very minor character, a minor remark. I was the only one who noticed and who cared in the whole cinema. But if you think, like, if this was in a medical context and somebody said, I'm on the wagon, and you didn't interpret it correctly, it might have huge implications, right? So now the provider does not have this information that somebody was drinking, right? They had alcohol use disorder potentially, but now they're not drinking, right? So that is a significant piece of information for sure. Great question. So I'm seeing some questions in Q&A, and I'll definitely address them. Okay, so another thing that can make it more difficult is how obvious is the meaning, because you can't always infer meaning from analyzing individual parts of the message. So you may say, you know, here's one example. Oh, you already know the scans are clear, but I wanted to deliver the good news in person. Who spilled the beans? So in this context, who spilled the beans means who revealed this news, right? And if we know what the beans are, it doesn't necessarily help us convey, you know, understand the meaning. And so the meaning for idioms may go from transparent, meaning even if you've never heard this idiom before, you may be able to understand it. So like, your mom is fierce as a tiger. I think in many cultures we have an understanding of the fact that tiger is a strong and brave animal, right? So that's easy to understand. Versus, you know, something like, I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet. Why are we talking about towels, right? Aha, this is from the world of boxing. Somebody might throw in the towel when they're giving up, right? But you have to know this to kind of understand this, right? So they can be transparent, they can be opaque. And whether a particular idiom is transparent or opaque to you really depends on your knowledge and on your background. Another thing that can make it easier is the fact that many figures of speech are frozen or fixed, right? So for example, Rome wasn't built in a day. This is an idiomatic expression and it's frozen. People don't say Milan wasn't built in a day. They don't say it took more than a day to build Rome. It's always going to be Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So these expressions do not change, and you can find them in a dictionary. However, speakers can also create figures of speech at the moment of speech. So this is a real phrase that I heard on the radio. Somebody said, this area of research is still in diapers. We need more evidence. So this is not an established idiom, and we can guess what it means, right? Who wears diapers? Babies, right? So clearly this area of research is a baby. It's newborn. Yes, but this is not something that is a very common expression. The speaker that's how they decided to phrase it. Similarly, signing up for a clinical trial involves a lot of steps, and I just wanted to give you a thumbnail of the whole process so that you know what to expect. So thumbnail, we know that on our phone, it's like a preview of all of your pictures. So yes, I'm giving you like a bird's eye view, which is another idiom, of course. So to recap, lots of different figures of speech. They may come from different sources, from culture, from sports, etc. A figure of speech may be fixed or frozen, well established, or it could be something that somebody creates on the go. And the meaning isn't always obvious, and we can't always analyze it from individual parts. So then, how do we deal with idioms? What do we do when we encounter idioms? To return to that quote by James Nolan that I showed you at the beginning of the class, the most common pitfalls to be avoided is not recognizing figurative or idiomatic language or translating it literally. And I'm sure, again, as practicing interpreters, you can realize that to interpret accurately does not mean interpret literally. Literal translation may be unhelpful and even confusing. Because if this idiom doesn't exist in your language and you say in Spanish or Turkish or Russian or Arabic, who spilled the beans? Is it going to make sense, or is the patient going to be like, what? What beans? I didn't spill anything. What are you talking about? Right? So a lot of the time, idioms cannot be translated literally. I had a little experiment here that I'm going to skip over in the interests of time. So what do we do if we can't translate it literally? Again, to quote the wonderful Mr. Nolan, for figures of speech, as for all other forms of speech, the interpreter's job is to get the gist of the meaning across to the audience within the time limits dictated by the speaker's speed. So our job is to make sure that two parties understand each other, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's say somebody used an idiom and you understand what it is. Maybe you've heard it before. Maybe it's like really transparent and you know the equivalent in the target language. So I'll give you one: between a rock and a hard place. There are examples, there are equivalents in many other languages. In the Russian language, we say between a hammer and an anvil. In the Arabic, I think it's between the enemy and the sea, right? In the Spanish, it's between, I want to say, the sword and the wall. So yeah, so if you're like, oh, I know exactly what it means, I know the exact equivalent in my language, excellent. Best case scenario. Just make sure that you don't interpret literally unless you're sure that it will make sense, right? Because if you say in Spanish it's raining cats and dogs, again, is the patient going to understand what you're saying, or are they going to be like, what? Where? Right? Now, it's raining cauldrons. Yes, we say it's raining as if like there's a shower. Now, let's say somebody uses an idiom, and yes, you are familiar with it, or you can easily understand it, but you just can't quite come up with the equivalent. Maybe it's even on the tip of the tongue, but you're like, ooh, how do I say to be on the same page? I'm pretty sure there is a good expression in my language. I just can't remember. Well, Mr. Nolan says, accuracy is more important than affectation. If you cannot think of time and tide wait for no man, or there's no time like the present, or never put off until tomorrow what you can do today, just say, let's not delay. So if you can't, if somebody says, you know what, we are between a rock and a hard place, I really don't know what to suggest. So then we might say, well, I can't remember that equivalent, or maybe one doesn't exist. We are in a difficult situation with no perfect answer, right? You interpreted this, the gist, the spirit. And then, of course, if you're not, the name of the book, I'll show you references. You can take a picture real quick. If you're not familiar with the figure of speech and you can't figure it out, so for me, like when I first started out interpreting in the US, sports idioms were really hard. Because, you know, I'm not from the US. I didn't watch American sports. So when somebody says, oh, guess what? We got your test results and you hit it out of the park. Is that good or bad? If we're talking about tennis, out is bad, right? So were your test results bad? And then, of course, now I know to hit it out of the park is a good thing. It means you don't score goals, but what? Score points? Whatever. Still don't understand baseball. But it's a good thing. When we say somebody hit it out of the park, we say you performed better than we expected. You did really well. So in this case, when we're saying we got your test results, you hit it out of the park, right? We're saying your test results are good. And we don't want to omit this expression. So we may think, it's just an idiom. What's the worst that can happen if I leave it out? But in my example, this idiom carries an essential part of the message, right? Whether or not test results were good. So then if you're not familiar, you may then say, you know, this is your interpreter. Could you clarify what you mean by saying you hit it out of the park? And then, of course, let the other party know, right? Well, context, yes, if somebody says like, I got your test results, you hit it out of the park, I can infer that it's a good thing, right? If you cannot see me on video, I'm like smiling and showing thumbs up. But if somebody says in a very even tone and you cannot see them, I got your test results, you hit it out of the park, I don't know, right? And then, of course, make a note of this idiom and include it in your glossary. Make sure that next time you come across this idiom, you now know how to say this. And you know, in the English language, there are over 25,000 idiomatic expressions. And to add to that, we also have thousands of proverbs and sayings and phrasal verbs and cultural references. So clearly, we cannot use them all, we cannot learn them all, but we can try to learn as many as we can. So notice idioms and other figures of speech in your daily life. I was recently there for physical therapy, and my physical therapist said, let's explore the low hanging fruit first. And I was like, oh, low hanging fruit, great idiom. And I wrote it down, right? So just look out for idioms in your daily life, maybe in the movies you watch, or, you know, you're talking to friends and they used an idiom. Write it down. Listen to podcasts about idioms. If you Google medical interpreter blog, I actually have a couple of articles about idioms, and I have lists of different like idiom podcasts or idiom apps. There, I don't expect you to necessarily remember this web address, but you can just Google medical interpreter blog and look for the idioms. Set up an idiom exchange with your friends, with your interpreter colleagues, right? So maybe once a week you meet up for coffee or talk on WhatsApp, and you're like, okay, so these are all of the idioms that I encountered during the week. I was stumped. How would you say this in Spanish? This is what I said. How do you think, what do you think of the way I handled it? These are my references. So somebody was asking the name of book. So the book is called Interpretation Techniques and Exercises. This is a book for conference interpreters. Idioms was only a small part of it, but this is such a great book that even this like small section on idioms, as you can see, helped me learn lots and lots of advice. So there are some resources out there for you to learn idioms in English. Clearly, in your working language or languages, there are more. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. My email is displayed right now. It's yuliya.speroff@gmail.com. We probably have a couple of minutes for questions and answers, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can address your questions. Analia.
Yes, thank you, Julia, for such a wonderful presentation. Everybody has been loving it. I do believe you answered one question already. Another one is, what is the name? Okay, that person answered that one. What is the difference between idioms and a slang?
Great question. There is really, idioms are an example of colloquial expressions. I would say colloquialisms is more of an umbrella term, and under colloquial expressions we have idioms, but also slang. So they're kind of cousins or brothers. How
Good
can
way
you
to
address
put
that
it.
into interpreting? So same, with slang, exactly the same way. If you can think of an equivalent, wonderful. If somebody says, dude, that's an example of like a colloquial expression. If you can think of an equivalent in your working language, great. If not, just maybe the closest one at least. And if you're not sure what dude is, you know what to do, right? Just like when you are not sure, when the doctor says, we're going to perform cholecystectomy, and you're not sure what cholecystectomy is,
Yes,
you'll be saying, as your interpreter, I'm not familiar with this word. So I know it may sound counterintuitive to equate kind of cholecystectomy, to equate a medical term and an idiom. But as we just learned, idioms and other colloquial expressions often convey important information, whether it is the meaning, whether it is the attitude of the speaker. So just like with everything else, it is our responsibility as an interpreter to accurately interpret them.
exactly. No, thank you so much. There is another one here. Would you please suggest us, and I think you did, but just in case, a website where we could look up to either learn or refresh on idioms? Do you have anything that you could post on the chat. That was another question.
Great question. You know what? I'm going to post a link to this blog article that I put together, and it has some of the it has some links. So as far as books, I will say that it's always great to learn. I'm sure you know to learn things in context. And so if you're ever looking for some sort of book or podcast or an app, I would highly recommend that they show you examples of how a particular idiom is used, because just like learning a list of idioms, I don't know necessarily how helpful it
Hmm.
is. You want to hear, and it's more memorable, right, when you hear it in
Right.
context. Yeah.
Wonderful. Let's see if I can find anything else. I think that was it because you already answered the question about the book, the title of the book, and what it says. What is the name of the blog? I would like to connect with the group or listening to the podcast. If you could please just put
Yeah,
that on the
so
chat again.
absolutely. I don't have a group necessarily. This is definitely up to you. This it's called the Medical Interpreter blog, and I have an article called Idioms for Medical Interpreters. So a lot of the information that I shared with you, you can find here. So you can remind yourself how to deal with idioms. You can see some examples of idioms, but you also, I'm sorry, I know I'm scrolling pretty fast, but also I have some links to examples like podcasts that you can listen to this. So I'm repeatedly sending the link in the chat because I know the chat is really moving fast.
Yes, it's
Lots of
going
comments.
fast.
Everybody, you're so kind. Thank you for your all of your kind comments. I'm so glad you're finding this helpful.
And I think that's it for the questions. And we had Julia. Thank you so much again for joining us today. This has been a wonderful, wonderful presentation. We have had over 760 participants, and we're just delighted and have learned a lot from you. So thank you so much. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a couple of other questions I wanted to address real quick, if that's okay.
Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
if you want to, yes,
Yeah, so
absolutely.
somebody said how acceptable it is to ask the doctor to use layman terms. It is absolutely acceptable. Just be ready that doctors may or may not follow through with this. And again, doctors are not doing this to make our life more difficult. They're not using idioms and they're like, let's see if we can make Yuliya cry by using 5 baseball idioms in the next 5 minutes, right? It's just how people talk. And we, as interpreters, we always think about words, we always think about how to phrase things, right? And other people may just not think that way. And so we can ask and be like, please don't use idioms, please use layman terms. And they may or may not comply. And then we'll just have to do our best to keep up with it, right? And to find ways to accurately interpret these idioms. And the same with somebody asked what exactly language curse words, foul language. Same way, Andrea.
Mhm.
And if you're like me, and if you don't curse in your daily life a lot, if it's not a language you're comfortable with, this is something you'll have to deliberately look at. You have to deliberately look up, how do I say moron in Spanish? How do I say the F word in Spanish? Or how do I say the Spanish language words? How do I say them in English? Because same exact case as with idioms. Just like you have to know how to say cholecystectomy, you have to know how to say whatever
Exactly.
words, right? Always our responsibility to interpret everything. So many good questions. I want to answer all of them, but I want to be respectful of all of your time. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and joining us today. And again, you will see very soon our upcoming trainings, our upcoming webinars for the rest of the year. Again, Julia, thank you so much. As you see, everybody has loved your presentation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.